week 2 of the history of the family in the 18th and 19th centuries. And if you watched the previous episode, I started talking to you about the demographic facts in the period being the basis for the book by Lawrence Stone, The Family, Sex and Marriage in England, 1500 to 1800, and we talked about some word definitions, some concepts connected to family life, and we also talked about marriage. There are two more aspects of those demographic facts that are quite interesting, and it's a good moment to talk about them before we go on to other subjects. So the next subject is birth, and as Stone notes, many people believe it's a kind of stereotype nowadays that the earlier we go in history, the more likely we are to encounter private homes swarming with children. So there would be lots of children everywhere, which did happen. It still happens. There are still some families that have lots of children, but it's not a norm now, and it was not so much of a norm especially before the 19th century. In the 19th century, we'll talk about it later on, families tend to be quite numerous. Before that, in the 18th, 17th centuries and earlier, you don't really have homes swarming with children. It does happen occasionally, but it's always something of a big thing. Stone gives an example of an early 18th century Scottish architect named James Smith, who had 18 children with his first wife, and when she died he married another woman and had 14 more children with her, with his youngest son born when his father was 70 years old. So altogether he had 32 children, most of whom survived. So this was an extremely numerous family, but it's not really a rule. From the Victorian period, which Stone does not really go into, but we will, there is another quite famous case of a huge family counting more than 20 children. This was the family of origin of Isabella Beeton, journalist and editor, known for her famous book called The Book of Household Management, and also the journal that she co-edited with her husband, the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine. So she was the eldest sister of a very, very large family. Why was it not the rule in earlier times? The part of the answer you can find in previous part, so that the fact that marriage was relatively late, in the mid to late 20s for most people, because of economic reasons, young people were supposed to be able to start a new household straight away, so at least the man needed to have a stable source of income or stable capital. So this was a good few years after the beginning of the fertile period in life. Also, from what we know of, you might say, forensic research, women in history usually entered their menopause earlier than today, at around 40 years of age, not like today in the late 40s to early 50s usually, or sometimes even later. Mostly because many people, especially in the poorer sections of the society, were malnourished, so they did not really get proper food and proper nourishment. And in the upper sections of the society, they avoided sunlight, so they were not getting enough vitamin D. So basically, there was some sort of food deprivations. What was also common, much more common than today, is premature death of one spouse. We'll talk about death in a little moment, but this was something that happened often. Childbirth, for one, was a very dangerous thing to happen. So people did not have children very young normally, and they didn't have children very often. So usually there would be longer intervals of at least 2 years between the birth of the next child. There might be miscarriages, there might be stillbirths which are not mentioned in the statistical data. Possibly there could be abortions. We do not really know much about that because they were basically in secret. But malnutrition and also the physical effects of long lactation could be important in limiting the number of children. And of course the rich had more children than the poor. They were less malnourished, they married a few years earlier, and it became quite popular, and this is something that we'll discuss at greater length later on, to hire wet nurses, that is special servants who would breastfeed the babies of the rich with their own milk, so that the mother would not have to involve in breastfeeding. This was becoming quite popular. By the 18th century, this was absolutely commonplace. So people had more children than today, but it doesn't really mean that all those homes were swarming with children. It did happen, but it was not the rule. As far as death goes, there is something very different from the perception of death nowadays. Something that continues throughout history, well into, I would say, towards the end of the 19th century and perhaps even into the 20th century. The idea that death is a constant threat, a constant presence. It is normal, it is considered normal for all ages, for anyone basically. Especially in cities with the outbreaks of epidemic diseases, and anyone could die at any moment. Death is not something for the very sickly or for the very old. Actually, infant mortality and child mortality are very, very high throughout the period. This is visible in the life expectation at birth, which is a kind of meaningless mean, as I mentioned last week, but it gives you some idea. So in the middle of the 17th century, Stone gives the life expectation of at birth at around 32 years. It doesn't mean that when you turned 32 you died, or you were expected to die, but that the threat of death was constant throughout your young life, that relatively few people lived to be older than 40, or well, the older they got, the fewer of such people remained. And first of all, that the survival rates of infants and children were not very impressive. Stone gives the numbers of children dying in their first year at around 20%. So 1 in 5 children died during their first year of life, and and before 15 years of age, so we might say the children who survived childhood and early adolescence, the death rate was between 1/4 and 1/3 of those children. So 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 children did not live long enough to celebrate their 15th birthday. There were all kinds of causes of death. Of course, the state of medical knowledge and the available treatments for now very common and curable, easily curable diseases were not there. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't even really know what caused diseases before the invention of the microscope. They had absolutely no idea about bacteria and viruses and other reasons for diseases. They didn't really know for sure how the diseases spread. There was a notion of the poisonous air, so the plague as a kind of cloud or fog of poisonous air. But not all diseases are airborne. So, for example, cholera, that is spread through contaminated water, was only understood in the 19th century, in the Victorian period, before all the attempts to prevent contamination by wearing some sort of face masks or burning some sort of incense to fumigate the air were not effective. Many babies died because of premature weaning, so the period of breastfeeding was too short, and any other foods, especially animal milk that was not boiled, so straight from the animal, was not safe for the babies, so they could have some sort of stomach diseases, all kinds of accidents, and basically little things that we do not really pay attention to, like a bone fracture perhaps that is now an easily treatable thing. They could easily lead to death or permanent crippling. Wet nurses who were hired to look after babies were not always very careful, so some children basically died of neglect. And the poorer they were, the more likely they were to die. Abandonment of children was still quite frequent. It does change in the 18th century. We have the first institutions like foundling hospitals, especially the famous Foundling Hospital in London, established by a charitable man, a sea captain actually, by the name of Thomas Coram, because when he returned from his business voyages back to London, he was appalled to see how many abandoned children lived in the streets of London. So he decided to found a charity to provide care for such children. So generally, you were very likely to die young. If you survived until adulthood, you had a fairly good chance of living until you were 60, but it was the point of surviving until your 21st birthday that really set you at an advantage. So there is something that, and we are going to talk about it because it's still present in the 18th century. We're going to talk about it at a greater length, but the further back we go in history, the less emotional involvement with children there is. For example, people would very often give the same name to one or two siblings in case one or more of them died. So if, let's say, the firstborn child, who would very often have some meaningful name, like the name of the grandfather or some other important ancestor, if this child died and another child was born, they would be given this name without any hesitation. The name was more important than the life of the child who died. So you could be named after somebody who recently died. Another thing that happens in the 18th century, and this is something that Stone describes in quite a lot of detail, between 1730 and 1770 there is a change in medical profession involving childbirth and perinatal care. So before that, if a woman was about to give birth, the family usually called for a local midwife. These were local women who were trained by other older midwives. They were not trained medical doctors, and they did not practice medicine outside of the very narrow field of care for the mother and baby. In the 18th century, on the wave of rationalism and enlightenment, many people, especially from the richer sections of the society, decided to turn to the professionally trained medical doctors, who would always be men at this time, rather than to a local midwife. So we have the category of the obstetrician, or as they were called then, male midwives. The first such recorded case happens in 1703. The man in question, the doctor in question, was even given knighthood by the king. His name was Sir David Hamilton, and he was the first, as it was called, male midwife. Why wouldn't it be effective? Because actually it was observed relatively soon that the survival rate for mothers and babies treated by those obstetricians rather than traditional midwives was lower than those treated by the midwives. The reason was, of course, that the doctors visited other patients than women in labor, and they brought diseases. They brought germs that caused infections and possibly put the lives of the new mother and baby at greater risk than the contact with an untrained midwife who only visited women in labor and not any other patients. The knowledge of the importance of hygiene was not so great. It was basically neglected. They did not believe in boiling the instruments, and actually the obstetricians were more likely to use some sort of mechanical instruments like the forceps in difficult births, and very often these were not properly prepared, so they could cause infections in their own right. What else could be a common cause of death? Epidemic diseases, which I mentioned already, that were especially dangerous in cities, and and the cures for them were very limited. Also, the failings in hygiene, it does start to improve a little bit in the second half or around the middle of the 18th century. We even start having the first vaccination against smallpox. We'll talk about it, it's a very interesting story. But other infectious diseases were still dangerous. Also, parasites, intestinal worms especially, they were quite a big risk because the food was quite often, more often than today, definitely, contaminated. Also, food contamination could have different reasons. Well, the water could be contaminated by latrines that would seep into the groundwaters. You would have basically everywhere the dirt, the excrements, the animal carcasses from butcher's shops or something. And the new system of dealing with the disposal of waste, and also the water pipes and new system of the use of waters, and also things like cemeteries that were overcrowded, especially in and around big cities like London. This is really something that starts to change in the late 18th century and continues in the 19th century, but these are still dangerous things. So what you have are bacterial infections and worms and dysentery, malaria. So you have still malaria in marshy areas in Britain. Tuberculosis, which is absolutely rampant, and nobody knows what to do. The childbed fever. So actually, Stone gives one piece of information that. Before the 18th century, 75% of first marriages were broken by death within 10 years. So, accidental death, falling off a horse, drowning. The medical profession was basically helpless. They had very outdated and obsolete methods of cure, like mostly bloodletting. They would open your veins and let you bleed, and this was supposed to cure mostly everything, but in effect it rather killed the patients than cured the diseases. So what would be the results of such situation? First of all, the population was very young. Throughout this period, including the 19th century, more than half of the population was under 20, and there was a small minority of people over 60. So basically this is a population consisting mostly of young people and children. Also, something that I already mentioned, the remote emotional connections with children, especially small children. As they grew older and survived some of the worst dangers, they could hope for more involvement from the family members, but infants were not really a focus of emotional attachment. People were generally too cautious to invest emotionally in small babies because they died like flies. Generally, what we have, and especially in those earliest forms of family that we are going to discuss in a little moment, is the concept of the family as a loose association of people who come and go. So one wife dies, you marry another. One husband dies, you marry another. A child or more dies, you'll just have new ones and hope they would survive. You do not invest so much emotionally in your relationships with people as nowadays. So that's the general introduction, and what I would like to do now is to talk with you about two types of family models that Stone talks about in his book before the 18th century. So these two types of family relations, family models, are called the open lineage family, and it's dated circa 1450 to 1630, and then the restricted patriarchal nuclear family from more or less 1550 to 1700. These are of course not exact dates because we are talking about some social trends and they take time to become dominant. So you may position these types of family life on a timeline, but of course some families never adopted them, some adopted them early on, some only in, let's say, the next generation, but the trends in the society are visible. So let's now talk about the open lineage family.